Okay, welcome everyone to the Mercer County Holocaust, Genocide, and Human Rights Education Center's commemoration of Native American Heritage Month. And tonight we are specifically talking about surviving genocide, Native America, and the legacy of the past. And with us tonight is our featured speaker, Dr. Alex Alvarez. And Dr. Alvarez is a professor in the Department of Criminology and Criminal Justice at Northern Arizona University. From 2001 until 2003, he was the founding director of the Martin Springer Institute for Teaching the Holocaust, Tolerance, and Humanitarian Values. In 2017 to 2018, he served as the Ida E. King Distinguished Visiting Scholar in Holocaust and Genocide Studies here in New Jersey at Stockton University. His main areas of study are in the areas of collective and interpersonal violence. His first book, Governments, Citizens, and Genocide, was published by Indiana University Press in 2001. His other books include Murder, American Style, 2002, Violence, the Enduring Problem, 2007, 2013 second edition, and 2017 third edition, 2020 fourth edition. Genocidal Crimes, 2009, and Native America and the Question of Genocide, 2014. His latest book, Unstable Ground, Climate Change, Conflict, and Genocide, was published in July 2017 and updated in 2021 with Rowman and Littlefield. Dr. Alvarez has also served as an editor for the journal Violence and Victims, was a founding co-editor of Genocide Studies and Prevention, and is an editor for Genocide Studies International. He has been invited to speak and present his research across the United States and in various countries such as Austria, Bosnia, Canada, England, Germany, Lithuania, the Netherlands, and Sweden. So welcome, Dr. Alvarez.
All right. Well, thank you. Thank you for that introduction. And let me see if I can share my screen and we'll get started here in just a second. All right. All right. And hopefully you can see the PowerPoint. Is it up? Okay, perfect. All right. Well, thank you again for the invite to speak with you tonight. I am very happy to be there, at least virtually, and to share some of the work that I've done in this area and to maybe talk a little bit about some of the issues in regards to our past and the history of Native America, especially in regards to genocide. So before we start that, actually, I do want to spend a couple of minutes telling you a little bit about myself and the work I do. And my presentation, as Dr. Krasner said, is based on a book that I wrote a number of years ago. And I wrote it because of what I do and where I live. What I do is that I am a criminologist who studies violence, in particular genocide, as you heard from my CV. Where I live is Flagstaff, Arizona. It's a city on the edge of the largest Indian reservation in the US. And living and working in Arizona, you quickly learn that Native Americans are an important part of the historic, geographic, social, and political landscape. And in recent years, one of the things I've noticed as a genocide scholar is that the word has increasingly been applied to Native America. And so somewhere along the way, I began putting these two things together, and this book represents my exploration of this issue, as this presentation does as well. So let me start with a quote that you all may be a little familiar with, and that is from William Faulkner, the American writer and Nobel laureate, who once wrote that the past is not dead. In fact, it's not even past. And those words are as true today as when he wrote them in 1951. The present continues to be shaped by the past. Our history is still very much with us and continues to shape and guide us as individuals, communities, and nations. And the identities we construct about who we are come from our history and our experiences. But we need to remember that the past is mutable. We remember selectively, and we create stories and narratives and mythology out of past events. And at the national level, our identity is largely something we have created out of a sense of shared stories about where we come from, what we've done, and what we stand for. And yet a lot of people suggest that this national identity is often nothing but, to quote a former colleague of mine, a myth agreed upon. And I start with this because as a nation, it feels as if we are engaged in a great debate about who and what we are. In an op-ed from 2 years ago in the New York Times, Roger Cohen wrote that in moments of national fragility, history rears its head, the past becomes a vast storehouse of grievance, revived memory is manipulated to produce violent nationalism. This is what is happening today in the US, a nation suddenly at war with its past. And I think most visibly, this war with the past has largely revolved around the issues of the Civil War, slavery, the memorialization of the lost cause. It's passionate, angry, and tragically, all too often violent. It's about where we come from, who we are, and what we stand for. But what I want to highlight is this is not the only part of our history that we're grappling with. Slowly, yet increasingly, we're beginning to more closely and perhaps a little more honestly examine our history in relation to Native America, to question the dominant narratives about our past on this continent. And what I want to speak with you about this evening concerns one piece of that process. Specifically, how do we make sense of the 500 plus years of history in North America post-contact, especially in regards to one particular issue, namely genocide? Now, few words seem to be able to evoke such an immediate and emotional response as this one word. Yet for all of its power and ability to elicit outrage and condemnation, it's a term that is much misunderstood and often misapplied. Oh, all right, excuse me, having a little technical issue there. Okay. Now, in recent years, it's become common to assert that Native Americans were the victims of genocide. But what exactly does that mean? A lot of times these claims are made with what I think are sweeping generalizations and not much specificity. What is the meaning of the word genocide, and what is the most accurate and meaningful way to characterize the historic and even the present day experiences of Native American populations? And so these are just a few of the questions I want to look at with you today, albeit briefly, given time constraints. And I do want to leave time at the end to answer some questions, maybe to have a little bit of a conversation. So as we get started, let me begin by highlighting some considerations for us. If you look at the slide that I have up now, you can see there's no single term that has to be used. Depending on who you talk with, there are a number of possible terms. Now, while the use of Indian alone generally is discouraged, American Indian, Native American are broadly acceptable and often considered to be synonymous. In other places, in Canada, for example, First Nations is typically used. Australia, the word Aboriginal is more common. These are the kinds of terms that are generally acceptable. Now, whenever possible, it's preferable to refer to tribal identities, unless you're speaking of all Native peoples in the aggregate. But even this isn't perfect, as the most well-known names are not only not typically used by members of that tribe, but some are even derogatory. So for example, the word Sioux, I'm guessing many of you have heard of this, is actually the Chippewa word for snake. The word Apache is the Zuni word for enemy. Iroquois, the Algonquin word for real adders. Again, a snake. Now, in Arizona, the Navajo, the largest federally recognized tribe in the US, are often referred to by their own name of the Dene. It is simply a word that refers to themselves as the people, and this is common among many different groups, as I have up here on this slide. But I think at the end of the day, what's key is understanding there's no one universally used name. Refer to tribal names whenever possible. But what is important is to simply try to be as respectful as you are able. All right, so why should we care about this issue? It is an issue that we should be interested in, not just in November, but because these are issues that are around us all the time, even if we don't necessarily recognize them. First, it's local. If we even take a cursory examination of place names in New Jersey, we see that many of them are of Native origin. And by the way, I will be moving through some of these relatively quickly. My apologies, I do suffer from that academic disease of wanting to put in as much information as possible. So I'll be moving through these quickly, but hopefully we will have time to maybe go back if you're interested in having some questions or discussion about particular issues as we move forward. I would also argue it's timely. In the news very recently, over this last year and a half, we find that Native boarding schools in Canada have recently found the remains of almost 1,000 Indigenous students from those schools in unmarked graves, particularly in boarding schools in Saskatchewan. The issue of murdered and missing Indigenous women is an issue that is also in the news a lot. As of 2016, the National Crime Information Center has reported almost 6,000 cases of missing American Indian and Alaska Native women and girls. Indigenous women are murdered at 10 times the rate of other ethnicities, and murder, in fact, is the third leading cause of death for Indigenous women, according to the Centers for Disease Control. We also know President Biden is the first president to commemorate Indigenous Peoples Day. And if you look at the third picture here, Secretary of the Interior Deb Haaland made history when she became the first Native American to serve as a cabinet secretary. She is a registered member of the Pueblo of Laguna. So not only is it local, not only is it in the news, we can also point out that I think there's a moral issue here as well. Looking at the issue of Native America, especially in understanding the role of genocide in the history of this continent, it does some important kinds of things for us. On the one hand, I think it provides a public acknowledgement and acceptance of the harm, the trauma inflicted, the injustice. I also think that ignoring the past comes close to denial. And it also teaches us important, valuable lessons to better help us prevent future outbreaks. This is the whole purpose of Holocaust and genocide education. We don't teach about these issues just solely for their own sake, but rather because we hope to learn more about how such violence is carried out and to better arm ourselves in the future to prevent future outbreaks. So in short, I think there are plenty of reasons why this is an important issue for us to explore and understand better. But it's certainly not an easy topic. It is a complicated, it is an emotionally laden, and it is a heavily politicized issue. How can we talk about the past in a way that is historically accurate, that avoids oversimplifications, and which doesn't suggest false equivalencies? This is made even more problematic by the fact that genocide has become the symbol of supreme evil. Definitional debates around genocide are often heard emotionally rather than rationally, as questions about the level of suffering, trauma, or harm. And we should remember that when we talk about genocide and explore this issue, these definitional debates should never serve to diminish the tragedy or the trauma of the post-contact experiences of most tribes. And these kinds of concerns are well summarized by a quote from the historian Alfred Cave, who has also written about these issues. And he writes, to characterize the processes through which Native American lives and cultures were degraded and destroyed as genocidal may express proper moral indignation, but it doesn't necessarily help us understand the complex, multifaceted, and often contradictory patterns of interracial and intercultural interaction on colonial frontiers and within colonies in the Americas. Because of the complexities and difficulties, there's often a tendency to oversimplify what is admittedly a very multifaceted history. Did I jump past? Excuse me for a second. Nope. Okay. There we go. We don't want to oversimplify, and this is what I see happens all too often around genocide studies more generically. When we oversimplify what are really very complicated kinds of phenomenon, it misrepresents what genocide is, and in this particular case, it teaches us the wrong kinds of things because it tends to treat Native peoples as passive, as helpless. It essentializes Native peoples into a homogeneous, unified group, and that is absolutely not the case because and the reality is that there were hundreds and hundreds of different cultural, tribal groups, each pursuing its own strategies of accommodation, resistance, adaptation, and so forth. We have to understand the agency of tribal groups and the various strategies they used. And it stereotypes Native people simply as victims, and they were and are far from solely that. All right, so hopefully this is all making sense. I'm sorry, the issue with Zoom for me is, as I was talking to Barbara earlier, is it feels like every time I give a presentation, I'm relearning the technology. So please forgive me for any of these kind of little goofs as we move forward. All right, so let's keep some of these complexities in mind. And let me just give you a quick little overview of some of the issues as we move forward. So generally, it's believed that the first Americans arrived sometime around 14,000 to 35,000 years ago from what is now Siberia. Most of them, it appears, crossed over the course of many generations in family bands of hunter-gatherers that were moving across the Bering Land Bridge, or what is often referred to as Beringia, and down through the North American continent. The Bering Strait is really very shallow, and it was an era of heavy glaciation, and during that time period, the ocean was about 300 feet lower than the present day, and it exposed a body of land that was about 55 miles wide, but about 1,000 miles long from north to south. And it wasn't a migration in the strict sense of the word, but an ebb and flow of people gradually trending eastward with successive generations moving further and further afield as they explored and as periods of warming opened up ice-free avenues down into North America and ultimately Central and South America. And over the course of thousands of years, they spread all the way down to the tip of South America, Tierra del Fuego, the land of fire. And along the way, over many generations, as they spread across the continent, they adapted to the specific geographic, the specific ecological conditions, and developed a huge variety of cultures and lifestyles that really, I think, is an amazing reflection of the human ability to adapt to different geographic extremes and so forth. Whether it's the Hohokam in the American Southwest, in what is now Arizona, that built extensive systems of canals and irrigation networks, or the Tlingit up in the Pacific Northwest, basically developing communal lifestyles and living off of the marine environment. The Inuit further north, Cahokia in the Midwest, so many different cultures, so many different tribal groups. But that all changed post-contact. largely because of the phenomenon of what we refer to as settler colonialism. Because of the nature of settler colonialism, think of all the places in New Jersey, right? Or in the United States that have the word new in them to understand the mindset of settler colonialism. Well, we understand it is about reshaping. It is about changing the environment, the culture, and the population of an area. And in the mindset of settler colonialism, Native peoples were often seen as a resource to be exploited, or alternatively as an impediment that needed to be removed. And the result was often catastrophic for different Native peoples, especially when we factor in the issue of disease. And we can't talk about the history of Native America without looking at the significant role that disease played in the destruction of the indigenous populations subsequent to first contact. And what we have here is a slide that illustrates graphically on the right side the decline in population. If we look prior to contact, estimates suggest that in North, Central, and South America, there were anywhere from 2 to 7 million people. North America alone, some estimates suggest anywhere from 1 to 5.5 million. By the late 19th century, the population of Native Americans were about 250,000. The all-time low was in 1900, 237,000. Think about that scale of the loss of life. Entire tribal groups, entire cultures disappeared. The diseases essentially found what is called virgin soil epidemics, where you had a population that had a lack of natural resistance for a variety of different reasons. I can spend a little time later on if you're interested. There was a lack of acquired immunity. In Europe, for example, there were a lot more zoonotic reservoirs that the population had been in contact with for generations that over time had built up resistance to disease. That was absent in the Americas. And there were cultural kinds of patterns that made the transmission of disease more common. And it doesn't help either that diseases such as smallpox, once it ran through an area, it remained infectious for up to 2 years afterwards, with everything that had been infected still being able to transmit smallpox disease. And among some groups, mortality rates for smallpox was upwards of 80–90% in some cases. Now, the question we can ask, do we consider this to be genocide? And this is something that different scholars of genocide have often debated. We find that in many cases, there were plenty of accidental, what we can call versus intentional outbreaks of disease that had to do with things such as when the first Puritans were rummaging around some of the abandoned communities that had been depopulated by disease, they actually came across graves where they found bodies of European sailors who had been washed up, who had ultimately died, but who spread disease. The best known case that probably illustrates the use of disease as a tool of genocide comes from what is now Massachusetts and Pennsylvania, excuse me. And that was when Jeffrey Amherst, in attempting to break a siege, dispatched a force of just about 500 men from what is now Massachusetts towards Pittsburgh. He wrote a letter to the commanding officer of that unit, and he wrote, "Could it not be contrived, quote, to send the smallpox among those disaffected tribes of Indians? We must on this occasion use every stratagem in our power to reduce them." The commanding officer of that unit wrote a letter back to Amherst in which he suggested that he was going to try to inoculate the Indians by means of blankets that may fall in their hands, taking care, however, not to get the disease myself. Now, there were more letters like this, but you get the idea. These written comments are very clear and convincing evidence of what can only be construed as genocidal attitudes and intentions toward the natives on the part of these colonial officers. The callous indifference to human life, or more specifically, Native American life, is appalling. Now, we actually don't know whether they actually carried it out because there was at the same time an outbreak of smallpox that occurred in that part of the area they were going to. It does appear that there were some other cases also where blankets were distributed that may have intentionally been infected, but regardless of how much we understand about it, how much we specifically know, this clearly evidences what we can refer to as genocidal intent. Now, moving past disease, and I realize I'm going through a lot of material just in the interest of time. But moving forward, we can talk about massacres. And this is where we also sometimes see the issue of genocide, more specifically in regards to violence perpetrated against Native Americans. There were a lot of infamous massacres that were carried out. The one I want to spend just a couple of minutes talking about, because it is particularly notable and does illustrate some of these kind of issues, I think, very well, is that the example of Sand Creek. This is a picture of the high plains of eastern Colorado. I'm guessing when many of you think of Colorado and you think of high plains, you might be thinking either of legal marijuana or you might be thinking of the Rocky Mountains or something like that. But the entire eastern portion of Colorado is this kind of terrain. It is prairie, but it is actually very high in elevation, and winter on these high plains can be incredibly cold. And the winter of 1864 and 1865 was no exception to that. And it was November 29th, 1864. Another reason why I chose this, because it was a November in 1864, bitterly cold, when a troop of cavalry reined in their horses on a small rise overlooking a dry creek bed in the early hours of the morning. Now, on the riverbed was a group of about 115 lodges of a Cheyenne band under the leadership of a man named Black Kettle, and this is a photograph of Black Kettle. There were also a smaller number of Arapaho lodges as well. Now, there'd been a lot of fighting on the plains that year, especially further north and further east. But Black Kettle, he was someone who always seemed to be looking for peaceful solutions. He was tired of the fighting that had been raging on the plains for most of that last year. He was worried about the coming winter. And so he gathered together a group of other individuals, other families, and they traveled down to nearby Fort Lyon, Colorado, to surrender to the military. The commanders of the fort did not have the resources to feed and to protect them for that winter. So they told them to stay in their traditional wintering camp, which was about 40 miles away on the banks of a dry, largely dry riverbed, a place called Sand Creek. And they were told that they should hunt, they should feed themselves, but to consider themselves under the protection of the US military. So this is a photograph of Sand Creek. It's a wide, dry riverbed, and it had often been used as a wintering ground. And if you look at the photograph carefully, you can see on the left side is the southern bank or bluff of the river bed that often had provided shelter from the wind. You can see some trees, especially further back, are the trees, and actually that far horizon area with the tree line is where the encampment actually was. And there were also a number of springs that provided fresh water even in winter. So, believing they were under the protection of the military, they settled in for the winter. Now, on that November 29th morning, the men who reined in their horses were members of the 3rd Regiment, a volunteer unit of mounted troops who had signed up for a 100-day stint of military service. In charge was this individual pictured here, Colonel John Shivington. He was a former Methodist minister. He was the first Grand Master of Masons of Colorado. He had distinguished himself during the Civil War, and his nickname was the Fighting Parson. He's the individual, you may be familiar with this infamous quote, when he was later asked by a reporter why he had advocated the killing of all Native Americans, including children and infants. His response was, because nits make lice. I think very deeply revealing in terms of the mindset, the dehumanizing mindset towards Native Americans. Highly bigoted, very ambitious, he decided to head to Sand Creek, even though he was fully aware that they had already surrendered. Evidently to him, all Native Americans were fair game, regardless of whether or not they were hostile or not. Now, the Colorado newspapers and popular opinion had actually been pretty harsh about him and his troopers. Instead of going and fighting where the hostilities were, they had mostly hung around the Denver area, hitting up the local bars and other establishments. And in fact, they had been nicknamed the Bloodless Third by a very derisive press. And I think this was undoubtedly an influence on his decision to attack the encampment. Now, not everyone agreed with him. A few of his officers argued that an attack on Black Kettle's band violated the pledge of safety given to them, that it amounted to murder. And this guy, Shivington, reportedly flew into a rage and shouted, "Damn any man who sympathizes with Indians. I have come to kill Indians and believe it is right and honorable to use any means under God's heaven to kill Indians." So on that early morning, the troopers lined up basically in the foreground of that picture that you have there, and then in line advanced toward that line of trees in the background where the encampment was. The first most people heard were the hoofs as they woke up and left their lodges. Most of them were simply met with gunfire. There were about 500 people in the camp. Only about 60 of them were warriors or old men. The rest were women, children, and infants. Now, as the attack began, one eyewitness described how Chief Black Kettle waved an American flag on a pole and told his people not to be scared because they were under the protection of the government. Eventually realizing the futility of this, he mounted his horse and fled, only to be killed several years later at another massacre on the Washita River. Now, White Antelope, he's the individual in the left of this photo. He was another prominent Cheyenne leader. He walked towards the troops, evidently with his hands in the air, and then stood in the middle of this dry creek bed with his arms crossed over his chest, indicating, you know, that he wasn't fighting, that they were a peaceful band. For his bravery, he was simply shot down. His body was later defiled and mutilated. Now, not all of the soldiers participated in the shooting. This is a photo of Silas Sewell, a captain. He was the one who had protested the attack, and he did not order his unit to open fire. In fact, he and his men simply stood by and watched as the rest of the detachment charged into the camp and opened fire. And within a few hours, it was over. About 150 Cheyenne and Arapaho were killed. Soldiers later testified that some of the troopers had made sport of betting on who could hit some of those who were fleeing, shooting children and so forth. After the attack, soldiers began looting the lodges, killing the wounded, sexually assaulting women survivors, and then mutilating the corpses, removing genitalia, draping them over their saddle horns, these kinds of atrocities. The bloodless third was no longer bloodless. Now, reactions to this massacre were actually mixed. Nationally, there was an intense sense of outrage and condemnation. Locally, within Colorado, Chivington and his men were lauded, with a lot of Coloradans believing that the attack was justified and appropriate. But at the national level, the reaction was the exact opposite. As word got out about the massacre, a number of investigations were formed, two conducted by the Army itself, one by a Congressional Joint Committee. And in its report, the Congressional Committee was especially scathing. Words such as murder, barbarism, savage cruelty were used to describe the killings. The committee wrote, quote, "It is difficult to believe that beings in the form of men and disgracing the uniform of US soldiers and officers could admit or countenance the commission of such acts of cruelty and barbarity as are detailed in the testimony." And if you read through the reports, and these are available, one gets a sense that there was genuine outrage over the mistreatment of Black Kettle's Band of Cheyenne at the national level. And it's clear that his attitudes and actions were genocidal. But in this, he was supported by large numbers of men and women in the Colorado Territory. Now remember, Colorado at this time was a frontier region in which many of the newly arrived settlers felt under threat by the various tribes. That spring and summer of 1864 had also seen a fair number of stories about massacres and attacks against whites and settlers, with a number of well-publicized killings, including the Hungate Massacre in the area near what is now Denver, where a family had been killed. The mother was sexually assaulted. The children had their throats cut. And these kind of things. And stories of this massacre and of similar kinds of things abounded in the months preceding the massacre, and they created what is essentially a sense of hysteria and panic among many Coloradans. Before the massacre began, as he ordered his troops to advance, Chivington reportedly told his men to remember the murdered women and children on the Platte. And it certainly did not help that anxiety and fear and that notion of revenge, that racist and dehumanizing attitudes toward natives on the part of whites were fairly commonplace in Colorado and led many to conclude that extermination was the answer. One prominent editor of a Colorado newspaper during that era wrote that if there be one idea that should become an axiom in American politics, it is that the red man should be destroyed. Similarly, a minister visiting Colorado in 1864 reported that there is but one sentiment in regard to the final disposition which shall be made of the Indians. Let them be exterminated, men, women, and children together. They are regarded as a race accursed, like the ancient Canaanites, and like them devoted of the Almighty to utter destruction. And it can go on like this for a while. But essentially, the point I'm making here is that Chivington and his men were products of a frontier culture that out of fear and racism despised and hated the Indian and sought to exterminate them, while those farther removed from the immediacy of frontier life tended to hold somewhat more humane attitudes and ideas about Native Americans. Now, we could review other massacres, the widespread genocidal violence against California territory after the start of the gold rush. It's the subject of one of the best books on Native genocides out there, a book by historian called Benjamin Madley. But in the interest of time, let me briefly review another aspect of genocide in this regard, and that is cultural destruction, or as it's sometimes referred to as ethnocide. And essentially, this is a kind of genocidal violence in which the bodies were generally left alive, but it was the culture that was the target of the violence. And in the 1880s, the US government shifted from outright violent extermination to attempts to forcibly assimilate Native American populations. And what you have is the development of a system of boarding schools, often thousands of miles away from their homes, where children were taken from their families, often at gunpoint, taken to these schools, had their hair cut, put in uniforms, put into military-style units, with the idea, as embodied by the founder of this system, who you see pictured here, a Colonel Pratt, who once remarked that they were going to kill the Indian to save the man. And it was a means of using schools and education as a way to destroy those things that made Native Americans unique as a people. You killed the culture, you killed the language, the traditions, the belief systems, the history. Yeah, and this is something that went on for quite some time. Running out of time, so let me just kind of start wrapping this up here. It is important, I think, to not stay solely in regards to this idea of genocide, especially not the idea that this is the entire history. Because the story of Native American is not just one of death, of suffering, of genocide, but it's also about resilience. It's about adaptation. It's about resurgence and survival. If we look at Native America today, especially in the American West, we see that it is a very vibrant and visible part of the culture and society that we inhabit today. There are close to 600 federally recognized tribes in the contiguous US and Alaska. The current population is over 5 million, with the vast majority of different Native populations living off of reservations. Now, it's true that many Native populations continue to suffer from a wide variety of various social problems. I've got some of the statistics here. This is something that many scholars, Native and others, continue to focus on today. In fact, what many argue is that this is the legacy of genocide. This is the legacy of colonialism that continues to impact populations. But even so, it's important for us to acknowledge that Native culture and peoples continue to survive and thrive. I put together this slide because I think it illustrates that we can see it in so many different ways, even if we don't necessarily recognize it. I'm guessing many of you are probably familiar with the writing of Sherman Alexie, for example, or you've seen some movies with the actor Jason Momoa, perhaps not even recognizing his indigenous heritage. We have within politics or popular culture or in science, you have, as I said, an ongoing, vibrant society that continues to shape and influence modern American life. And so let me just conclude with this quote from James Baldwin. To accept one's past, one's history, is not the same thing as drowning in it. It's learning how to use it. An invented past can never be used. It cracks and crumbles under the pressures of life like clay in a season of drought. And I liked it because it teaches us that while we have to acknowledge and understand the past, we don't necessarily have to stay there, especially in regards to genocide solely. So with that, let me say thank you for your attention. I realize I went through a lot of material in a very short period of time. It's always a challenge when you have such a complicated and a long history with so many different groups, trying to put together pieces in a coherent fashion. I hope it made sense for you, and hopefully you might have a few questions or comments that we can address. And thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Alvarez. So I ask all of you attendees if you have any questions or comments. You can put them in the chat or just raise your hand. So I'll start with a question.
Okay.
So as a college educator, teaching U.S. History 1 and 2, at what point should I talk about Native American genocide?
Well, in terms of what I mean, are you talking about specific classes on American history? Are you talking about just the whole history? I mean, I don't know that there is an answer to that, and that is something we wrestle with. So here in Arizona, for example, I'm on this task force that we were successful in getting genocide and Holocaust education mandated in Arizona, something New Jersey has had for quite a few years.
Yeah.
And a big part of the challenge has been trying to figure out what portions of that history do we bring in, right? How do we make these issues relevant for students living here in, you know, the 21st century US? It really depends on what you want to focus on. There is no one answer. My personal feeling is you find specific issues or specific events that relate specifically to larger issues that you are addressing. So for example, rather than trying to talk about genocide en masse, kind of as I did with an overview here, focus on specific events, right? So for example, one of the things I did is I put together presentations on essentially population displacement, ethnic cleansing, right? And talking about the Trail of Tears, talking about the Navajo Long Walk, which especially here in Arizona has a particular relevance, being that it happened not very far from here at all. So, you know, it really is about finding places where you can make, where you can look at issues that are relevant for your students, that can engage them, that can get them interested in this, but not overwhelm them because it's so broad and overwhelming in terms of the scale of the issue. You know, Barbara, I don't think I gave you a very good answer there. I'm sorry. You know, that's something that we struggle with as educators all the time, right? What pieces do you teach about? And that's true for teaching about the Holocaust or Rwanda or Cambodia or Native history as well.
And, you know, along with that, I'm always looking for literature, and I mean literary, to be used as text in the classroom or to recommend to K through 12. And there's not a whole heck of a lot that is written by a Native American. And so I can't remember his name now. Joseph, begins with a B, is a well-known Native American author of children's lit.
Okay, yeah. You know, you're right, there isn't much. And so it's oftentimes piecing together different materials, but in terms of books or material written specifically for different age levels, it is still emerging, right? There's a lot for college educators. In fact, there's David Troyer's work, for example, Benjamin Madley's work, a brand new book that I just got. I'm very excited about this Finnish-born British historian who wrote a book that is essentially completely reversing the narrative about the history of Native America in regards to settler colonialism, and arguing that basically there was a lot more agency, a lot more success in Native people shaping the outcome of different events or resisting and so forth and so on. And David Troyer, a Native scholar from Minnesota who's written quite a lot on these issues, he gave it actually a glowing review. Really thought this author did a very good job. But in terms of K through 12, in terms of books for younger readers, yeah, it's tough.
So who's the author of the book that you're excited to?
Have it right here.
Ah,
Pekka Haimalainen, and he wrote a wonderful book about the Comanche. A few years ago, it wrote, I think it won the Bancroft Prize. And like I said, I just got this. It's a very new book. After reading David's review of it, I thought it was something I really want to tackle.
great. So we have a question from our
Okay.
audience. So Jeremy writes, I'm interested in risks and triggers for genocide. I'm familiar with your work on climate change. Do you see that work as relevant to the history of U.S. interactions with Native Americans, or is that history more associated with the settler colonial project and not other factors that might show up today?
Great question. Thank you for that, Jeremy. You know, again, I don't know that there's an easy answer to that. I think it is relevant. I think one of the things that I've been very pleased to see in recent years is that Holocaust and genocide studies are increasingly waking up to the reality of environmental issues, environmental conditions and factors, and its relationship to not just genocide, but warfare as well. Right? Think about the work that's been done on ecocide in the Holocaust that has been appearing in recent times. I think looking at these different kinds of issues in terms of Native America, or I should say more broadly, indigenous populations, issues of colonialism, colonial relationships, exploitation, resource extraction, these are things that are not just about the past in regards to indigenous populations, but they're actually part of what's occurring right now, right? If we look at what's been occurring in Egypt with, I don't know if you've been following the COP27 in Egypt going on at the moment. One of the issues they're talking about are the fact that those countries in the developing world that are the most impacted by climate change, that are the least responsible for it, are increasingly wanting reparations or funding or assistance in helping them mitigate, or at least ameliorate a little bit, some of what they're experiencing, right? That there is an obligation there because it is these kinds of colonial systems of exploitation and development that are responsible for this mess we're in now. And I would say you can draw clear parallels with the past and the present there. Does that get at all with what you're looking at, Jeremy?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, you know, we hear obviously in terms of the past and U.S. history, we don't hear a lot of talk about any environmental factors that might have been driving the treatment of Native Americans by you know, folks in the United States. And so I was just wondering if you saw additional factors besides just wanting more land, and maybe the wanting of more land in American history is tied to environmental factors, access to water,
it's about,
access to,
right. So it is about resources. It's about, you know, it is about, you know, land grabs in many ways. And I would also suggest these environmental or ecocidal kinds of issues are ones that are affecting indigenous populations to this day.
right.
Out here in Arizona on the Navajo reservation, uranium mining over much of the Cold War, the legacy of that is still being felt here. If we pay attention to what's going on in the rainforests in Central and South America in terms of deforestation and the displacement of
Right.
indigenous population, or the outright murder of
Yeah.
indigenous activists trying to protect their land. These things are all very much connected, right? And what
Yeah.
we're seeing is that the consequences now are global in scale in terms of, you know, the rate of change that we are experiencing in terms of climate change.
Yeah. Okay, great. Hey, would you, this is really of interest to me. Would you be okay if I reach out to you via email to continue this conversation?
Not
Okay.
a problem. Happy to do that.
Will you share that, or was that on an initial
It
slide or
was, I
something?
can, it is actually, it's just alex.alvarez at
Okay.
nau.edu.
Okay. All right, cool.
Yeah.
I'll reach out. Thank you.
Yeah, you bet.
All right.
Thanks. And Jeremy, I believe, is a Grazie
Oh,
that Al was
wonderful.
talking about before. And so we have a question from another Grazie, Anna May. Do you hear First Nations reference to the Holocaust when describing their violent histories, and specifically regarding the residential school system?
Oh, sure. You know, the language, you know, the thing is, these days, when I first started doing work in genocide, very few people had heard the word or used the word and so forth. There was not a common understanding of it. That's changed hugely. And in fact, I would suggest that the word genocide and the word Holocaust, both in some ways, have assumed kind of the status as the kind of most heinous kind of crime that there is. And so we use it a lot, and different individuals, different people, whether you're talking about activists from communities or scholars trying to call attention or understand phenomenon, make these connections fairly frequently. So I would also say it goes both ways, because if you look actually at the Holocaust, and if you look at some of the speeches, some of the writing of Nazi leaders, they frequently referred to the American treatment of Native Americans as a template, as a justification. Hitler referred to the Volga as their Mississippi, and talked about what they did to the Native Americans, we're going to do to the Slavic peoples. I mean, things like this. In the contemporary era, I also hear Native American scholars or community activists or others who are trying to call attention to the history of their tribal groups reference not just the Holocaust, but genocide, right? In terms of trying to better understand what happened, but also the continuing legacy, what we refer to sometimes as intergenerational trauma, or within some Native communities, they talk about a soul wound, right? That these things are ongoing issues that these populations continue to address.
Thank you. Does anyone else have a question? I think that might be all we have. So Dr. Alvarez, I want to thank you so, so much for your presentation and your thoughts tonight. Thanks for your engagement with our participants. And I wish everyone a good night.
Thank you for having me.